Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about how we work at the organisation I come from, Thrive, but also then widening out to talk about therapeutic horticulture in the UK. My background is in psychology within mental health, forensic mental health services, which is where I first came across the idea that gardens could be therapeutic. It's not something that back in the early 90s they really talked about on a psychology course. There we go, that's helpful. Thank you. So it was only through actual practice that I first sort of recognised that these people who were often expected to engage in talking therapies with psychologists and things like this were actually sometimes more affected by just simply being in nature. Many of the hospitals I worked in had good grounds, essentially, and good landscapes around them. And a number of people we were able to talk about, and not just myself, but other health professionals, identifying that very few changes have been made in the treatment for certain individuals, and yet they appeared to be better once they were in some of the hospitals where I worked with good grounds as opposed to in hospitals with less good grounds. There are also gardens being used in a therapeutic way under the guise of occupational therapy. And many of the patients that were supposed to be doing other sorts of interventions would go to the garden but would have lots of resistance to other type of interventions. So I became more and more interested over the course of my time within forensic mental health, and then when the opportunity to work for Thrive, who are the Society for Horticulture Therapy in the UK, came about for me, it was one that I was only too glad to take. Thrive as an organisation have been going since 1978, so we've been interested in this for over 40 years now. We were set up by Chris Underhill, who has set up a variety of different charities around the world, a serial social entrepreneur, if you like. And it was his vision, along with the founding chairman, Geoffrey Udall, who was a paediatrician at St Bart's Hospital in London, that actually a return to some of the principles of using nature in healthcare had been lost, and we needed to reintegrate that into our health service. Back in the Victorian period, in the UK, there was a hospital pavilion movement, for example, where the hospitals were taken out of the cities and placed within rural environments because people recognised there was something beneficial about just simply being in nature. As we see with some of the quotes here, or the ancient Persian word paradise, which has a literal translation of walled gardens. Actually, humans have, through most of history, understood that there's something inherently valuable about being connected and spending time in nature, a vitamin, just like any other that we might need in our lives. But Thrive as an organisation are not just interested in the way in which gardening and nature can be good for health and wellness, but also specifically interested in how it can address people who are experiencing ill health or disability, and how for them as a group of people it might hold an even greater value. And we're predominantly about people first. We view gardens and nature as a vehicle towards health and wellness. And so when there are a few tensions or even conflicts that might arise in the way that you practice therapeutic horticulture, because in this presentation I'm talking about it in relation to its other agendas, how it can be supportive of communities and community regeneration in some instances, and how it's also supportive of other agendas linked to environment, like climate change. But actually for us as an organisation, our founding mission is to alleviate the distress and ill health caused to people in necessitous circumstances, as our mission says. So essentially people with disability, people with ill health. And so we're all about people and gardens. We work predominantly in 3 centres around the UK. So we have gardens in London, in Battersea Park, if people know London, fairly central. Our founding site is just south of Reading, which is actually the estate of our founding chairman, who bequeathed it to our charity upon his before his death, actually. And then more recently, we've taken over gardens in Birmingham, which is sort of a city in the centre of the UK, where we're renovating what used to be the television gardens. So people in the UK would recognise them because it's where Gardener's World, our famous sort of BBC gardening programme, was shot for many years, and we're currently renovating those gardens. And so across a week, around about 250 people come into our gardens, and these are people from right across the ill health and disability spectrum. Our biggest group is people with intellectual disability, who make up around about 60% of the people who come into our gardens, but then the other 40% is made up of a real mix: people with mental ill health, people recovering from neurological injury, people recovering from accidents in relation to their musculoskeletal system and things like this, people with sight loss from birth, right across the spectrum of anybody who could be considered to be unwell and need some form of support or some form of service that helps them to lead a good life in spite of any disability or health that they might be having. All of the images across my presentation are taken from our gardens, but there are a couple that aren't, and I'll point those out as we go through. Now, in the UK, we're a nation of gardeners, without doubt. According to Mintel, a big marketing sort of research organisation, around about 16 million people in the UK garden regularly, okay, which is coming close to about a third of our population. So it might be one of the biggest shared identities that we have in the UK, that we do garden. And generally speaking, UK cities have good parks infrastructure, and so for people who don't have their own garden, then often they're spending time in parks within cities and towns, which are essentially large public gardens. And so in lots of ways, perhaps in the UK, gardening resonates as a form of nature that we are comfortable in, that we feel safe in. When we don't really have much wilderness left in the UK. We're not the most outdoorsy of folk. You will find more wilderness therapy and forest therapy and things like this in other parts of the world. You'll find more care farming in other parts of the world, other approaches to nature. Different cultural connection to nature is definitely important in the way in which it can be used as an intervention or even recommended through public health as an activity in your life that's good and healthy for you. But gardening perhaps has some other values that I'll talk about in a moment. But this model up here just describes a little bit about the way in which green care, nature-based health promotion, and nature in everyday life can be thought of. Looking at it in a centric model, this essentially is based on a model that comes from Natural England. Natural England is a government body that sits underneath our Department for Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs. And this was published through work by Rachel Bragg and others. And this is a slightly modified version of that model, just showing it in circles to show that they all fit together rather than in the columns that it was originally presented. But it does suggest that at different points in somebody's life, we might need nature in a different format for us in order for it to provide that vitamin, in order for it to give us the basic nourishment that we can see in the evidence base that it definitely does provide people. And so without doubt, most people, when you're well, will be even weller, will be happier and healthier, and you'll be promoting long life in yourself. And if you take your children into nature, you'll be promoting long life and healthy life in them. So nature in everyday life is critically important for societal health. But then there are some at-risk groups within our society, people who have a family history of diabetes, for example. In the UK, diabetes is currently the most expensive part of the health service. It's an epidemic within the UK. And so public health messaging to encourage people who are at risk of type 2 diabetes to get into nature, go for a walk in the woods, visit parks, take up gardening in a community garden or in their own space. This is really important public health messaging that can make a big difference to the cost of health systems within the UK. And so there are some groups who perhaps can be identified as particular populations who might benefit from more public health initiatives. Some of the great public health work that's happened in the UK in recent times in relation to this agenda is through our wildlife trusts, our Trust for Conservation Volunteers, these not-for-profit organisations who essentially are the bastions of and the carers of our natural world. And they've set up great volunteering schemes, and they've got very good at supporting people who are on the periphery of ill health into their volunteering positions, into their organisation, into their conservation or garden spaces. And so health, nature-based health promotion is an equally important part of how nature can be used to address societal health. But for us, we work within the green care, the smallest of the circles. We're working with people with very identified needs. Like I say, people with intellectual disability, recovering from neurological illness, people with mental ill health, right across that spectrum. And when we're working here, we have to, a little as Inga was talking about, we have to essentially provide a more structured program. We have to be a little bit more careful in the way that we guide that person through the experience in order to maximize the benefits that can be made through time in nature. But what we do at Thrive isn't just simply time in nature. There are other components to it as well. But like I say, let's just talk about gardening as one part of nature and how that's good for you. Because gardening is a very interactive hobby or pastime. It requires a fair amount of engagement. You can create fairly low maintenance gardens, but actually when you're gardening, you're nurturing other living things. You're part of the process of caring for the natural world. In other approaches to nature-based interventions, you might be a little bit more experiential or even passive within the way in which you're engaging in your dose of nature. Now, I think that if your connection to nature is through forests, is through the natural world rather than the sort of semi-natural world that perhaps we could view gardening as, then perhaps actually the benefit of connecting to nature in a way that's important to you outweighs the more occupational benefits that you also achieve through gardening. But gardening, without doubt, provides a full range of physical movement and exercise. So it's great exercise. It's around about a half to 2/3 as a cardiovascular exercise in comparison to something like jogging or swimming. So it's not as energetic as swimming or jogging. It doesn't work your cardiovascular system quite as well, but it does a pretty good job. It elevates your heart rate to around about 20% above your normal heart rate, and it maintains it there, maybe for 5, 6, 7 hours at a time. I'm sure in the room we've got plenty of people just like me who go off to our allotments and say to our partners, I'll see you in an hour, and then 3 hours later we have to come back and make our apologies because time slows down and we become engrossed, and after we've seen one thing to do, we notice something else we can do. And all of this is great for our health, but maybe not always so good for our relationships. Eventually people are more tolerant of me. Obviously, as well as working our body, it helps work our mind as well. So it's a very cognitive activity, but it's not so stressful in the way that it's working our fixed attention, not like working on a laptop or even reading a book. But there are moments in a gardening journey, moments in a gardening moment where your brain is being activated, where you're having to think, you're having to problem solve, you're having to diagnose why isn't that growing as well as it did last year. And what that usually does is put you onto this moment of real fixed thought that then drifts into all sorts of possibilities. Because when we garden, we recognize that to some extent the garden's in control and we are the visitors to that space. And so the reason one plant isn't growing this year as well as it did last year, there's just so many different reasons. And we can explore all of them as we go about our time in that space. Obviously, it gives us a chance, therefore, to be connected to activity that is meaningful. Meaningful because it's caring for the natural world, as I say. There's an element of nurture going on. And this can change the way we think about ourselves. It leaves us satisfied. It can change our identity. We can feel more positive about ourselves and our impact on the world around us. And this, again, straight away links to the way in which gardening as an activity is essentially pro-environmental. Now, there are all sorts of complications in the way that we garden in the modern world because often, actually, the way we garden involves other things that are less environmental, like the way in which our plants are produced in nurseries and things like this, perhaps not necessarily always sticking to good sustainable practice. The UK is about to make buying peat compost illegal from a retailer in the UK, but it will still be available to commercial nurseries. And so we will still be using up peat, which is essentially devastating peat bogs in the north of England and across Ireland. But it's not us who are doing it. It's being done further down the train. So gardening isn't always 100% pro-environmental, but in the actions of you gardening, it near enough always is. You can garden in ways that aren't so good, obviously. But it can change our self-identity, give us something to be proud about, and make us feel good about the way in which we have an impact on the world around us. And obviously through that opportunity to care for other things, we might be thinking about how we can develop nurturing habits for ourselves as we care for each other. And so our thought process in the way that we think about caring for gardens may well transfer into the way we think about caring for ourselves and caring for others. And all of this is happening not in Thrive, not in an intervention, but just in the everyday activity of gardening that we might do as a hobby. And through that, it provides that opportunity for us to enrich our environment and perhaps even share things with others. So often if you grow tomatoes, then you'll always grow too many. You know that all your tomatoes germinate, but you still sow every seed from the packet. And so you're going to have 10 tomato plants. And so, of course, it's sensible to give them away to neighbours, leave them outside the front door and see if somebody picks them up and takes them away. It gives us a shared conversation with others. As I'm talking to you now, I can see some of you looking back at me because you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because although we come from different parts of the world and I can't speak your language, we can converse over the act of gardening. We are gardeners together. And so this gives us a shared identity and a shared connection to others that can be really, really important, particularly in a time when actually lots of systems within the societies we live pull us apart. It's a really flexible hobby as well, if you think about it. You know, I mentioned right at the beginning how it puts our body through every range of movement you can think about. So you can modify the way you garden over time so that perhaps it's something that we can continue doing from this size all the way up here, and then as we start shrinking down again. If we are, thrown a curveball in life and experience a period of ill health, we can find a way to keep working in the garden. Sometimes that needs some consideration and some help. And as well as our gardens where these people with ill health and disability come, we also provide a service where we give information so that anybody can carry on gardening. And each month, around about 10,000 people view our website information, which is about how to reduce the maintenance needs of a garden, how to create a garden that you can manage from a seated position, how to garden when you're struggling to bend, how to garden if you've lost the use of one arm, all of this great advice, how to garden with sight loss and so on our Get Gardening information service. 10,000 people each month look at this information and they tell us it's valuable. But it's a flexible and broad hobby. It's something that we can engage in right across the life journey. I myself, I was raised in a garden by my grandparents and my own parents who garden. I left it as a teenager, as I think many teenagers do, with more interesting things perhaps on their minds. But you return to it. And I think the majority of people who were gardeners when they were with their parents and grandparents do very much return to gardening. And it becomes a pastime at the right time in our life, perhaps. Now, gardening for us is a style of nature that is an interaction between humans and nature that we appreciate. And within what we do in social and therapeutic horticulture, STH as I might slip into as an acronym up here, we can see that what we actually have is a combination of different valuable therapeutic opportunities. All three of these things can be evidenced to be good for us. Time in nature, time being active and occupied, and time in a social environment. And what I'll do is I'll just talk a little bit more about the natural environment, because that's what we're here for, I guess. But I will also note a little bit about what I mean by occupation, what I mean about social connection and the importance of that as well. The evidence base that exists now for how nature is good for us is incredibly well developed in comparison to where it was just 5 years ago. Okay, I joined Thrive, like I say, around about 14 years ago. When I came along, the majority of research in relation to how gardening was good for you was either being conducted by environmental psychologists, which was a very new avenue in psychology, or by occupational therapists. We could literally go to maybe 2 or 3 journals and find everything we could to read on the subject. But now, you have to do incredibly complex literature reviews to dig it all out because the evidence base has expanded. It's a difficult thing to research because it's very difficult to put the controls in place that you can with other interventions. You'd literally have to lock people up in rooms with no daylight, and no ethics board is going to thankfully allow you to do that. But what we have instead is a range of corroborating evidence that comes from small-scale studies right around the world. So when we explore what are the mood-boosting impacts of time in nature in Korea, Germany, the USA, or Chile, we find the same results coming back. That as little as 5 minutes can be valuable and boost our mood, and that somewhere close to around 2 hours is a good dose, after which the benefits start to plateau. So there's lots of these small-scale indicative studies. We need some more advancing research techniques to expand it further. But as I talked to you in Latvia today, perhaps actually you're at a good time to come into this because some of the harder work perhaps has already been done. And if there are any researchers among us, then I would advise you to be very careful that you don't end up repeating something that's already been demonstrated really quite clearly. There are some more meta-analysis reviews of the whole literature base being done that point towards policy change for governments to think about in relation to how we think about green infrastructure, how we think about making sure that green infrastructure is equally available to people living in poorer societal conditions and those who live in richer societal conditions. Thinking about incorporating nature, green space and gardens into everyday life as well as health interventions. And so these meta-analyses are very important and they can be easily found with some searching on the internet. The real evidence base for why nature is inherently good for us, why spending time in nature essentially probably stems, or at least is clarified for us by Edward Wilson, the American biologist, in his first book, The Biophilia Hypothesis, The Human Connection with Other Species, which he publishes in 1982. In this book, he essentially argues that because humans have spent the vast majority, the absolute vast majority of their evolutionary history in nature, and not just our own evolutionary history, but the evolutionary history of our ancestors, then it's only natural that we have a much more comfortable relationship with green environments and natural environments than we can possibly have for the environments that we have built for ourselves. And so this is really the first question. This is the big question. To what extent is time and contact with nature crucial for human health? Is biophilia, is it crucial to human health? Do life and love come together through our connection to nature and our time in the natural world? And it spawns, I guess, two fairly well-established research streams. The first one, is probably attention restoration theory. This is developed by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan from about actually 1976 onwards. I've been told by some colleagues in America that they started to think about it, but it became published across the 80s and eventually in their Experience of Nature, a Psychological Perspective in 1989. It puts forward that humans have attention in all sorts of different ways, and we're overworking in the modern world our ability to focus our attention. And in doing so, essentially, we find a population much more mentally fatigued than perhaps it's ever been in the past. Okay, if I think about my own daily routine, 5 or 6 hours every day on a laptop, the human brain wasn't designed for that. There's an evolutionary mismatch going on, perhaps, that's leaving us tired. And we need sleep, obviously, because that restores mental fatigue. But what they were also able to demonstrate was that time in nature restores mental fatigue. This is one of the images that isn't from Thrive. This is an image of the Aunarp garden at the Swedish College of Agriculture. This garden was designed on 4 principles. If you're coming to the workshop tomorrow, I'm giving you a bit of a sneak preview. This garden's designed on the concept of being away, that the garden has extent enough to occupy our mind, that it has features of soft fascination, things to draw us in and focus on, and that it's compatible to our needs. And when this garden is tested for its ability to restore cognition in comparison to other green landscapes and also urban landscapes, it comes out on top across 3 different studies, all looking at the same. And essentially, when a meta-analysis has been done, when a literature review has been done, it's found multiple studies showing cognition is improved after time in nature. But the human brain is made up of more than cognition. We have an emotional side to our brain as well that is connected with the cognition. And so not only do we find that we're able to better proofread or be better at mental arithmetic, which is often the test they're using in these sorts of studies, we also find actually that people are more tolerant. People have a higher level of understanding of other people's needs after a time in nature. Because when our mind is rested, when our brain is rested, we all know what it's like to be tired. We can see the difference when we're not tired in ourselves and in the way that we respond to others. And so time in nature, without doubt, provides this element of attention restoration. And to some extent, sometimes it could be viewed as this other theory, stress reduction, as being in competition, but they're not. They're likely both working together. The stress reduction theory, because they're both psychoevolutionary theories, was first put forward by Roger Ulrich after he did his seminal piece, View Through a Window. He reviewed essentially the recovery of 2 sets of patients recovering from the same operation under the care of the same surgical and clinical teams in the same hospital. You can imagine, most hospitals around the world look the same. You've got a nurse's station in the middle, 8 beds on one side, 8 beds on the other. On one side, the view through the window was of a brick wall. On the other side, the view was of a garden. And those who viewed the garden asked for less analgesic medication. They appeared to be experiencing less pain. Okay? They also were discharged sooner. So there's something in the way that it reduced stress that promoted physical recovery. Physiology is operating better because of the view of nature, and they even appeared similarly to have less surgical complication. And so Ulrich is proposing that essentially the benefit of time in nature is actually occurring more through the emotional side of our brain, impacting on the limbic system and the pituitary gland and the way in which the brain secretes positive hormones to keep us happy and healthy. Okay. Now, these 2 things are likely going on together. Like I say, they're not in competition. And since some of this research, because this is going back to the 80s and 90s, we've had a whole range of more sophisticated studies start to look at other physiological differences through time in nature. And we can see that actually time in nature has the benefit of improving our immune system. It reduces blood pressure, helps our circadian rhythm, which means that we sleep better, and even potentially see better child development, both pre and postnatal. Okay, so these are studies that aren't conclusive. Again, they're smaller scale. This isn't necessarily nailed on universal truth, but it's good indication that time in nature is incredibly valuable for all of us, for our physiological health. Okay, with the child development one there, for example, if as a mother you spend time in nature, your child is considerably less likely to have allergies. If your child as a young child spends time in nature, they're likely to have a larger hippocampus and extended telomeres. Telomeres are the extension of the nervous system which replicates our DNA. So by taking your children into nature, you're promoting, like I say, a happier and healthier life just through that early intervention. And this again is where public health messaging and everyday life can make the biggest difference in society. But as I say, at Thrive, we don't just work, we're working with people with defined needs. And so we think about this combination of different therapeutic opportunities as something that's working in tandem, okay? It's not just about the time in nature, it's also about the activity and occupation. And when you look at the studies that look at things like the more interactive nature-based interventions, like therapeutic horticulture, like care farming, without doubt you see a clear element within that research that indicates that it wasn't just nature. There's also something going on in relation to the way people are being occupied. There's potentially other things going on in relation to the way people are connected to each other within that environment. Maybe it's not just all about simply going into nature again. Maybe it's not just a return to Eden. Within activity and occupation, obviously, we have a huge evidence base that comes from the world of occupational therapy. I won't go into it because, because there's other things to say. But, as one reference to follow if you've not come across the world of occupational therapy before, is to have a look at the work of Gary Kilhoffner, who developed the all-encompassing occupational therapy model, the model of human occupation, first published in around about the turn of the century, but continues to be worked on. When we're occupied, essentially as humans, we tend to be people who feel productive, feel pride in the production that we're involved in, feel as if we're able to contribute to our family and our close community, but also through that to our society as well. And according to the model of human occupation, evidence of this can be found when we can see people with a strong occupational identity or feelings of occupational competence. Hands up here, who's good at everything? Good. We did have some medical professionals in, just in case you put your hand up. Hands up if you think you're pretty good at one or two things. That's good, because that's usually enough, isn't it? If we can feel able in some areas of our life, then we can let go of the fact that we're not perfect at everything. Okay? And so occupational competence, that feeling if I can do this is something I can do well, can make a big difference to people. And often the impact of ill health and disability takes that feeling away from people. As Kilhoffner would describe in the way he talks about it, our personal causation changes. The ability in the way in which we think about ourselves and the ability to do these important things in our social species is reduced, and occupation is a great route to it. And as gardening is so flexible and so varied, we can find ways for anyone to garden. Okay, we're talking about people with really serious disability. We can help them become very competent with one or two things in a garden through tried and tested methods, usually tried and tested methods from previous people experiencing the same disability, working it out, and us essentially as an organisation or our practitioners acting as the memory for that. We're just sharing other people's experience sometimes. And then we have the social environment. And obviously, you have huge amounts of different research and different academic considerations for the importance of social connection. So we could think about it at a societal level and think about social inclusion and how important it is to feel that you're included in society. And usually my audience would be an audience with a different type of diversity, because in the UK we have a diversity that comes from all around the world. And it's important to feel socially included. We can see that through our experience of integration for people from different parts of what was once our Commonwealth and before that our empire. And so social inclusion is definitely important. Feeling as if you have a say in your society and you can make a choice, and perhaps as Latvians you have an experience of that. But also at a more local level, to be socially connected, to know a few people who you can rely upon. I'm fortunate enough to have some really good friends, but there's one friend I go to when my car breaks down, and there's another friend I go to if my marriage broke down. Fingers crossed. I won't give him a call just yet. And so, at a lower level, that social connection is really, really important. And then on an individual level, it's important. It's important that no matter how many people we have contact with, we don't feel lonely. We feel as if we're being listened to. We feel as if we're being heard. And within our therapeutic horticulture, where we're working with one practitioner supported by one volunteer with 8 clients, people are part of that social environment and they're being supportive of each other. And so we operate using these 3 different evidence bases, okay? And this provides us with a multimodal model of intervention, essentially, which is probably the reason that therapeutic horticulture has struggled to find a group that it isn't useful to. Because if one group benefits from time in nature, listening to Inga and talking to Inga at break, thinking about how, if you're going to use forest, then naturally that environment provides you with wonderful immersion in the natural environment, a more passive experience, okay? And so for some groups of people, therapeutic horticulture can be more immersive. For some groups of people, it can be more about the activity and occupation, and for other groups, more about the social environment. And perhaps each element works better because they're next to each other. Perhaps we're more able to be tolerant and understanding and supportive of each other in our social environment because our backdrop is nature, it's a garden. Perhaps we're more able to be active and occupied and be successful and feel occupational identity and occupational competence because we're being backed up by a social environment that is willing us on to success, that was built in nature. And so we take these inherently therapeutic elements and we essentially use a guided model to make sure that our practitioner is working effectively with each individual. We're person-centered in the way that we think about it, and we're person-centered probably in a very sort of traditional Carl Rogers type of way. We are very much interested in the core tenets of psychotherapy, although we are not psychotherapists. We want to first and foremost provide everybody with empathy, gain an understanding of what their frames of reference are like within their life. We need to be able to have a continuous, unconditional, positive regard because we're working with people who are affected by disability and ill health in a way which makes life a challenge. Okay, and we're asking them to challenge and grow and do better. And that in itself is tough and hard. And so sometimes people will fall. Sometimes people will have to start again. And so we need that unconditional positive regard. We also need to be acting in a congruent way the whole time. We need to be honest and open, and we need to be ourselves with each individual to develop the rapport that is there in the link between the practitioner and the person. Okay? And so we build a rapport and we have a relationship, but it's a bit different to talking therapy, as I'll mention in a moment. But essentially the practitioner's role is also to support each individual in their relationship with the garden. So we need to understand that person's affinity for nature, as we would describe it at Thrive, but more recently is being described by some other health professionals and researchers as nature connectedness. What is it that each individual loves about the garden? Or is it actually not so much about the garden? We have people with intellectual disability who have chainsaw licenses because they're more interested in making and construction. And essentially we use activities centered on horticulture, not just horticulture. So we will expand our activities to accommodate people and to enable them to be connected with occupation that is meaningful to them. And so we need a relationship which understands that affinity for nature, and the practitioner also has to understand and develop the relationship between each person and the activities themselves, grading them so that the person can learn how to do it successfully. We're applying good horticultural practice in the way we work. It's important. Horticultural principles are crucial to therapeutic horticulture. Horticultural practice, not so much. So we can move away from standard practice, but it's the principles that make sure that at the end, the garden is thriving and growing well, and that we're connecting people to the right activities that they are able to do so that they can be part of that process. Okay, and that requires us to do an assessment to get to know each individual in relation to who they are as a person, who they are in relation to nature, what are their physical and cognitive and sensorial abilities. We're focused on what people can do, not on what people can't. And then it's important also that we have an understanding. So again, another element of assessment is to understand that person's personality and what are they like in groups. How are they as part of a team? So that we can guide them in that relationship between the person and the social environment. And as well as time being active and doing gardening, or time enjoying the garden and being immersed in it, we will spend time talking about what makes people good. What makes you a good friend? What makes you somebody who's a good team player? Why is it that this person's so good when this happens, and why is that person so good when that happens? And this conversation doesn't come from the practitioner necessarily. Quite often it comes from the social environment themselves, because of the nature of the way we've set it up, but also because of the nature of the activities that we're involved in. But we are working with people with a defined need. And so for us, in order to be like other health professionals, we need to be clear that there are outcomes to this, defined outcomes that we can measure. And so the practitioner has to be in charge of that as well. The box that surrounds everything I've talked about so far essentially is what social and therapeutic horticulture is. That's the guided model. But it has to interact with the community around it. It's really important, in fact crucial, that the person's outcomes experienced in the garden are experienced beyond the garden. It's good having happy faces and people liking coming to you. In fact, it's the first sign of success. People come back. If the person's come back, then you must be doing something right. But actually, real success comes when that person transfers the benefits gained from the process into their lives beyond it, so they can be more independent and have greater agency in their lives. And so through this guided model, essentially we take time in nature and we turn it into thriving nature. On my workshop tomorrow, we'll talk a lot about how we create compatibility as part of that attention restoration theory principles. What's compatible? Because actually we don't want a show garden. We often want a garden that's thriving but a little rough around the edges, so there's no performance pressure and you can feel like you can make a mistake in that environment. But essentially you need 80%, 90% of the plants to thrive and grow, okay? We will accept that 1 year in 20 even the courgettes don't grow, but most of it needs to thrive. Plants need to come to fruition. There's nothing therapeutic about plants dying. And it's separate from occupational therapy in that way. Occupational therapy focuses on the process of occupation, with the result less important. For us, the important thing is that, that the garden does live because we're caring for something alive. And so, it's about changing these things through that model, time in nature to thriving nature, time being active to meaningful occupation. And that meaningful occupation can be, as I've already said, in relation to how that person views themselves in relation to nature and activity. But it could also be meaningful because essentially it supports them towards outcomes. Okay, so again, it's the practitioner doing all of the hard work to ensure that it's as therapeutic as it can be, that we're maximizing the impact of these inherent values. And again, that we're working hard to ensure that the social environment is predictably positive, because not all social environments are. There are some social environments that can be harmful to us, okay? But we can work hard to make sure that our environment is predictably positive. So we can ensure that everybody understands that there are some ground rules of how we behave here. And we usually do this by getting to know the person, having a two-way process. Assessment is a cold word for getting to know people. What we like to think about is assessment on induction. We learn about them, but they learn about us. And through doing so, we're in a really good position. Around about week 3, this usually happens. You say to the person, so you've been coming to Thrive for a couple of weeks now. How do you think we should all behave towards each other? And they'll say, oh, well, we need to be kind to each other, give each other enough space. I accidentally spoke over somebody the other day and I knew I shouldn't have done. Need to be careful of the plants and the property. And you say, well, that's brilliant because that's what we've got on my list. And so you work that social environment. You think about how you make that person comfortable through getting to know them, through getting to know their preferences, so that you can help that person slowly build the relationships they need to build. And through the provision of a shared identity and a sense of belonging, we create this sense of togetherness and a positive, a predictably positive social environment. You can see all of our gardeners here, and there is a therapist and a volunteer there as well. But all of us are there in purple. This is a market garden just south of our centre in Reading, a national heritage, the National Trust place where we look after the market garden. You can see our group returning from a day harvesting. But again, there's this change of hierarchy that I mentioned. Yes, the core tenets of psychotherapy are important to us. They're what helps us to establish a good rapport with each individual. They guide us in working in an ethical way. But actually the experience for the gardeners, for the client gardeners who come to us, is a very normalized experience. We're all in it together. Practitioner and client gardener working alongside each other, caring for these plants, harvesting these plants. And so creating that sense of community and that sense of belonging is very important. And it changes the hierarchical nature of what we do as therapists. The people these guys that thrive here, this garden is visited by around about 30 to 40,000 people each year, okay? Because it's in a National Trust property, like a stately home that people visit not quite as ground as Downton Abbey, but it's still quite nice. And, you know, they create this beauty that other people benefit from, okay? Because there are benches all around this space. And every day, other people from who these people have never met come and benefit from being in that garden. They take time out, they rest, they soak up and immerse themselves in nature, which we know has a benefit to them. And they're gaining that through the efforts and endeavours of people who are living with the challenge of ill health and disability in their lives. And so our client gardeners can come away very proud of the fact that they give back, that they contribute. And this is happening all in one model. Now, Thrive is not the only therapeutic horticulture organisation in the UK. We also have Trellis up in Scotland, our sister organisation, and there are other local network groups all around the UK now as well, because across the UK we would estimate, we don't know for definite, we haven't done a complete cataloguing for some time, but we would estimate that there's likely to be somewhere between 1,500 and maybe 3,000 settings in the UK that are using therapeutic horticulture. Okay, in 2005, the last time we were able to fully catalogue it, it was 980 places. Since then, we know that there are hundreds more that have been set up. One of the ways we know this, for example, is because at that point in 2005, 62% of all of the garden settings were settings providing for people with intellectual disability. When we did a smaller cataloguing of around about 330 in a national survey in 2019, the difference in client group had changed drastically. So more people with mental ill health were accessing therapeutic horticulture than people with intellectual disability. And so this is one of the reasons that we think that there are probably anything up to around about 3,000 therapeutic gardens in the UK. Okay, because often like I first came across it under the guise of occupational therapy, some of them may be very small, others like ours. So these guys have come from our centre just south of Reading, which is 4 acres of Victorian walled garden and 3 acres of land surround it. So huge amounts of horticulture, huge amounts of plant growing. And in that garden each week, 100 people are working away, so we need that work for them. So some are on a much smaller scale, maybe 6 or 10 people coming together on a Wednesday afternoon in a local community garden or allotment. Maybe a twice weekly program running in a mental health service somewhere. But there's a lot of therapeutic horticulture out there in the UK. And not only does it benefit each individual who attends, but it also benefits the environment. And so this is one of the key overlapping agendas that we can see in the way that we work. I describe it that way on purpose, as an overlapping agenda, because as I started off, we at Thrive put people first, okay? We are interested in people. Some people who come into therapeutic horticulture, their point of inception, their starting point was actually environment, like the Wildlife Trust that I'll have a picture of for you in a moment, for example. And sometimes that leaves them with a little bit of complication when it comes to dealing with the occasional tension that might occur between being kind to nature and being kind to people. So Garden Organic, the organisation in the UK that promotes organic gardening, they would probably tell us that we use too much petrol, because we like to mow lawns with petrol mowers, we like to trim lawns with petrol mowers, because we like to give people with intellectual disability the feeling of empowerment that comes through those activities. And so that's just one little example of a very slight tension that can occur. If I was running an allotment program, a food growing program, an allotment in the UK for people with mental ill health, and they were coming once a week with me, I'd be really tempted to use a herbicide, because otherwise those gardeners may only experience weeding as an activity. Okay? I'm not saying I would, I'm just saying that I would think it through. I would want to look at the attrition of the people coming to the group. How often are people leaving? I'm an allotment gardener of 20 odd years. when people leave, I make a point of asking, why are you leaving? And some have been there 15 years and they're leaving because they're moving and things like this. But the number one reason, weeds grow quicker than vegetables. It gets said in 100 different ways, but essentially that's what people say. It's not as easy as they thought it would be. And so sometimes there's this slight tension, but it is slight. Most of the time, being kind to nature actually has an active therapeutic element. This is a quote from a client gardener that I met at Sonata, which is the National Sustainability Organisation in Ireland, okay? And it's he's talking about this guy, Luke. Luke, gardening's good as a hobby, as a profession. It comes with a few risks. Bad knees for a start. And Luke was somebody who'd gardened as a market gardener he was in his late 60s when I met him first. And he was struggling with his limp. But this client gardener I was chatting to, I said, what do you like most about coming to here? And he said, well, I do love it. I love the space, but it's Luke. He's such a nice man. He's so kind. And he told me what Luke does as he gardens. He collects snails and slugs and puts them in a bucket. And he does this for the 6 hours they're in the garden. And then he walks the bucket 2 miles with his limp all the way down, or 2 miles down the River Ninny, to give slugs and snails their freedom in a patch of land that he cultivated for the snails. Okay? And that's his statement. If he's that kind to snails, think how kind he'll be to me. And so this general kindness to nature transfers to kindness to each other in a very powerful way. And so at Thrive, we're not organic because we're on old farmland, there's chemicals in the soil, we wouldn't be allowed to be. But we let nature look after itself. Huge amounts of investment because we've got the land, so we can have bug hotels all over the place. It's a great activity anyway. There's land that's left to just rewild. There's a lot, I don't know if Latvia, you have a lot of talk about rewilding. If you really want to rewild, just leave it alone. Don't touch it. It'll rewild itself with its own pioneer species. And in the UK, that means nettle and bramble for the next 30 years. And eventually we might get some trees. But people like flowers, wildflowers, they live on the periphery, but never mind. And so this importance of being kind to nature is now understood very well, that it's not just about being kind to nature, it's about being kind to the human race as well. Now, I mentioned the biophilia hypothesis. This is a grand theory. So too is eco-psychology. The idea that if the planet is well, humans are well. It's a huge hypothesis that's going to be impossible to ever prove. But it feels generally intuitively right, okay? And we have in the UK at the University of Derby, fairly recently, 3-4 years in now, the Nature Connectedness Research Group, who are really trying to explore the relationship between kindness to nature and other pro-environmental behaviours as a result of connection to nature. So essentially, if you get people more connected to nature, will they in turn therefore be kinder to nature? And what impact could that have on biodiversity, climate change, and so on? But it doesn't just create, and add to the natural environment through what we do at Thrive and up to the 3,000 others out there, as well as the other nature-based interventions who all have similar overlapping agendas. But we're also creating community through these processes. So on the left-hand side there, you can see a leaflet from the Natural Health Service. This is the Wildlife Trust volunteering service. The Wildlife Trust is a national organisation that's broken into regions. I think there are something like 19 regions or 18 regions across the UK, and there are around about 6,000 volunteers currently supporting the conservation and biodiversity in different conservation spaces around the UK. And it's not just the Wildlife Trust. You have the Trust for Conservation volunteers as well. You also have all sorts of interesting research that stems from a lot of this field. A lot of nature-based interventions have been the case study for research looking at how we can essentially create fairer societies through nature-based interventions through reconnection with nature. And the middle one here is essentially promoted by, which was a government-paid piece of research, the Marmot Review, which looked at inequality in healthcare. and inequality in health outcomes across different socio-economic stratas across the UK. And like I say, in so many different pieces of literature review and meta-analysis, the policy recommendation is often to do with how nature can help us overcome health inequalities. Nature-based interventions can do this, or certainly help level the playing field. We live in an age where health has become the new wealth. It's no longer possible to demonstrate your wealth just through your material goods. You also demonstrate it through your health and your health outcomes as well. And as well as the thousands of places across the UK where you'll find a therapeutic horticulture program, you also have even more community gardens. Who knows how many community gardens there are in the UK? Because again, they can be of such varying different sizes. And, allotments, I'm not sure how well this translates, but allotments which are essentially vegetable growing plots that you can be allocated by your local council. They exist in every town and city in the UK. I think in some boroughs of London, there's currently a 6-year waiting list to get a plot. So we could work to adjust that. We could open up more opportunities for people to be doing that and for communities to be regenerated. And in turn, by having these oases of green space across all of our cities, air pollution starts to go down, people's mental health and mood starts to go up. Humans even stop assaulting each other just through implementing more green infrastructure. And gardening and horticulture can be a big part of that. It's a particularly big part perhaps in the UK because, like I say, we are a nation of gardeners. And so nature for societal health is the key agenda for Thrive and for others in social and therapeutic horticulture, but without doubt it connects with other agendas as well. And this can be very valuable for perhaps some of you in the audience who want to start up these initiatives, these organisations, knowing that actually, for Thrive, around about 10% of our funding actually doesn't come from anything to do with health. It comes from regeneration of nature, okay? We get funded to do it, and there is funding out there across the EU for such work. The other thing that I think it's worth noting here in Latvia, where it would appear that you're having your first sort of real coming together as people interested in nature-based interventions and the power of nature connection to be good for people and good for health, is that this has already been recognised by the medical community. So you have people like Matilda van der Bosch in the Netherlands, for example, pointing out how relevant a resource it is for public health. You have people like Sir Richard Thompson, the chair of the Royal College of Physicians, our late Queen's own doctor for a period, who thought for many years that a prescription of a course of gardening would be very valuable for people with depression, post-neurological injury and so on. And so we've had medical professionals in other parts of the world already note and start to be able to talk about the benefits that integrating nature into health services, but also across society, can have for all of us. Because we know that with all of our incredible, wonderful medical interventions that we can have for all sorts of ill health that used to mean death, they're very expensive. And so if we want to afford that, we've got to become more salutogenic. We've got to change the way we think about it and try to focus more on the things that promote good health, as well as just simply trying to treat bad health in the traditional pathological model. And it's people at the top of these health systems who recognise this. People like Dr. William Bird, who recognise that if therapeutic horticulture could be brought to the same practice and quality standards as other interventions like physical therapies and occupational therapy, then actually the cost savings to the health systems, which for the UK is the NHS, would be in the millions. Millions, possibly even into billions each year. We've already started this with the movement of social prescription, although we need some more sensitive research to get this right. At the moment, if you're a provider of a social prescription service, i.e. Thrive, you do not get paid. At the moment in our National Health Service, all of the money in social prescription is in link workers who connect family doctors to the community groups that they send people to. But they'll realise it's working. But if they want it to work sustainably, they will have to actually put some money in the hands of those who are delivering it. And I'm fairly sure that if you, like we, start doing this regularly in Latvia, then you will note that not only does it seem to be good for all of us, but actually it's transformative for some. People with really difficult stories and backgrounds in relation to their health. This is John, a very famous case study of ours. Essentially, John was mentally unwell, really, really unwell, treatment-resistant schizophrenia he was diagnosed with for 20-odd years, wandering, between different times being detained, different times in step-down services, different times homeless, for 20 years. And then he came to thrive, whereas he said he felt human affection in a social group for the first time. He felt as if he was talked to on a level. He was very resistant to intervention because he felt that people were talking down to him. In a garden, he felt he was being treated as an equal. And it was also through mixing with others that he talks about. And the mix of activities, not just doing things, but just spending time enjoying it at the end of each session. And so if you do manage to start something yourselves, if you do get involved in this yourselves, then you'll see lots of people grow and heal, but you'll also see that occasional person for whom it is absolutely transformative. John still leads a really healthy life. He did work for Thrive. He now works for Mind, a mental health charity in the UK, advocating for other people experiencing mental ill health. And he's a great story of how those elements within person-centered therapy are so valuable to what we do in therapeutic horticulture. The belief that everybody has growth within them. The belief that people can lead a life that they want to lead. And that actually when to be healthy is to be continually on that journey. Not necessarily focused on the destination, but just recognizing the journey, which in many ways is a really powerful metaphor that we see in gardens. The garden itself is never finished. It's always evolving, always growing, always something new to see. The familiar and the unexpected all in one place that perhaps helps us resonate to our own lives and the way we're feeling about ourselves and others. Thank you.
So thank you, Damien, for this very comprehensive overview of horticultural therapy and the benefits of this kind of practice. I think that speaking to a Latvian audience, it falls on fertile soil, probably. I don't think that we have data about the percentage of the population does gardening regularly, but I think it's understandable concept. But I had a question because it was already alluded to previously. Do you get this type of experience in Britain? A type of previous horticultural traumatic experience, because living in Latvia, especially living through the 90s in the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of people had to rely on gardening for sustenance. And I certainly remember from my childhood being kind of not forced, but having to go around with a bucket, not picking slugs, but Colorado potato beetles. And it certainly was a traumatic experience for me, and I think I'm only now kind of returning to this idea that gardening could be an activity that can be enjoyable, actually. So, what is the experience in the UK? Do you have this kind of?
Yes, but perhaps less universally. And so, if we speak to some, populations of people from Afro-Caribbean communities, then they might relate to some of what you're saying, of that time when they were living in the Caribbean and actually gardening was an act of sustainability, or even people who, through the fact that the concept of being black and working in a field is not always a healthy identity for somebody. And so I think that, there are these elements of trauma or elements of discomfort that you can find in individuals, and perhaps you can probably find it in some groups more than others. But I think that, one of the ways that I think, I'd be interested to hear if Sue thinks similar to I do, but it's one of the few occupations in the UK, I think, that isn't so entrenched in class. From our king, who famously gardens and talks to his plants, to very eccentric men who put boxes on the end of their sheds so they can sleep at the allotment. From the highest to the lowest, we all garden. Would you have that sort of similar thought, Sue?
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. I think there's a phrase that gardening is a levelling activity, and that it helps bridge people across social classes. This connection that comes through the love of plants. You referred to like the language of plants as well, that it connects people. There might be all sorts of other social divides, racial divides, class divides, whatever. But if they love gardening, that shared love of gardening, I think, is something that does connect us. But I think the point you're making is really, really important, and I certainly came across it in the research that I did in the USA, where the legacy of slavery is really felt very, very strongly still, and that working the land is seen as a demeaning activity or a kind of punitive activity. And I think the important thing about the kind of gardening we're talking about is it's not about survival. This is about entering into a caring relationship, a nurturing relationship with the natural world. You might be growing flowers. You might be planting a garden for wildlife to restore biodiversity loss. It may not be about food production. And it's not necessarily about having to feed yourself, being forced into this activity. So I guess that's about a kind of a mental shift, isn't it? And acknowledging the reality of that trauma. It's an intergenerational trauma, isn't it? And that does take time to work its way out of way out of social attitudes.
It does get passed on, doesn't it?
It gets passed on,
through the generations. I mean, that's it's certainly. I mean, we set up a project with War Child, which is an NGO in the UK, and so I spent time in Central African Republic setting up gardens, effectively for children who had been involved in war, not just affected by war, involved in war, child soldiers, child prostitutes and things like this. And it was very much, without doubt, it was crucial that we made sure that it was a different type of garden to the one that they were previously experiencing. And so, and it was really difficult. It took about a week for me before I really felt that I'd communicated effectively with these horticulturists who were going to run these 6 different gardens in 2 different parts of a country at the very bottom of the Humanitarian Development Index, in order for them to grasp just these simple things of it's not just about food for sustenance. It's not just about growing to eat. It's about a different type of garden, a garden where you can be free from some of these things. And so I think that's really important. And again, why I've shown the Thrive Guided model, but why actually having a model is important. Because by having a model, you can put it together in a way that overcomes these potential barriers to inclusion or barriers to success. And so, But I think individually it occurs in people in the UK, doesn't it? But in certain groups, but maybe actually predominantly our shared experience of gardening is more in relation to pleasure than it is chore.
I think that's right. I think there's also something, if you're thinking about how to shift cultural attitudes, about who your role models are. One of the examples I give in my book is an urban gardener in Los Angeles called Ron Finley. He styles himself as the gangster gardener. He's black, and he was prosecuted by the city for growing vegetables in front of his house, which he was sharing with the street, but also growing flowers. But he very consciously presents a kind of a model to young black kids of it's cool to garden, it's cool to grow your own food, and you know that actually he says, you know, just get out the spade, let the spade be your weapon of choice, you know, because gun crime is such a so I think it's about role models as well that can help shift public attitudes.
Thank you. And I think that this change of perspective is kind of very refreshing. Not growing necessarily vegetables, but maybe food for slugs. This is a great example.
Yeah, I mean, if you know, in the UK, you know, all styles of horticulture are within our sort of identity of gardening. So, you know, every Thrive garden is a complete mix of different styles. Essentially, I mentioned that, you know, 4 acres of Victorian walled garden. There you have 17 gardens within those 4 acres. There's an Oriental style garden. There's a perennial border in full sun. There's a perennial border in shade. There's a woodland garden. There's a herb garden. There's an orchard garden, and there's also an orchard. There is vegetable growing going on, but actually there's all styles coming together, because if you want to connect people to what's their affinity for nature, what do they love, then actually a mixed style of horticulture is more valuable. And again, this is what I mean by, you know, I mentioned, you know, where people come at it from different inception points. Sometimes those different inceptions cloud people to doing it right for people occasionally. And so, you know, sometimes people, these therapy gardens start up initially being a food box scheme for people who are struggling to feed themselves in a cost of living crisis and things like this. And so they miss that value of ornamental gardening that might be more inclusive of some of their people. And so often, you know, the first bit of change we ever make to them when they sort of engage with us is we wrap that vegetable garden. We surround it with ornamental in order to expand the different types of plants that are there and essentially create different activities, therefore, and also different ways of connecting to plants.
Okay.
Yes, hello. My name is Arta Deniņa. I work in a primary healthcare. I'm a doctor myself, and I was listening to your inspiring talk, and I thought, what a great culture you have in the UK in terms of greenery and gardens and so on. And I have a couple of questions. Well, unfortunately, in Latvia, I think when one visits hospitals or when one is in a hospital, the greenery is rather limited. And that's really unfortunate, I find, and I just wonder what are the steps to be taken, how to introduce more gardens or how to reintroduce gardens in the hospital surroundings. And that's one question. What's your experience? Maybe you can share with us. The second question is how to become a garden therapist. What are these steps to take? Is it some kind of a special educational program, or who teach these people to become garden therapists? Then I had some more questions, so let me think a little bit.
I think we can let
me answer.
Damien answer, otherwise he'll forget.
I think the first question is about recognizing that you can add plants into the smallest of spaces. Okay, so, you know, it's about being a little bit clever horticulturally, and this, I would imagine that in this room there are some really good horticulturists who would be able to help work out how you can add green to the smallest of spaces through vertical growing and things like this, through good plant choices. Sometimes, you know, when you think about horticulture in primary care, obviously, you know, there's so much other important clinical work going on that even as somebody who's absolutely in love with the idea of therapeutic horticulture, I have to acknowledge that there's more important things to be doing in those settings sometimes. But actually, and we would describe there being, you know, different types of therapy garden. So when I'm saying 1.5 to 3,000 therapy gardens, I'm talking about gardens. I'm talking about social and therapeutic horticulture gardens, where groups of people come together and do the gardening. But that's different to a healing garden. And it's healing gardens that you tend to find in hospital spaces in the UK, and not in all of them. I paint a rosy picture, perhaps, and and perhaps you notice how much I close my eyes when somebody says that word. The UK has such a wonderful culture, because I won't defer to you again, Sue, but there are some good things, yes. But there are some not such good things as well. It's about recognizing that you don't need huge amounts of space. Smaller spaces can be used. Often in the UK, you'll find a healing garden quite close to essentially the multi-faith room, the chapel, because they serve very similar purposes. They provide respite for people. They give respite to everybody as well. But increasingly, we are starting to see within the design of newer settings, gardens being incorporated into the design of hospitals. In Sue's book, there's a lovely picture of Horatio's garden, for example, which is a very, very famous example. Started off with Cleve Wester, Salisbury Hospital, and now I think they're up to, is it 7 or 8 of them around the UK? Isn't it? Oh, okay, I won't spoil too much. But it's recognising, and our founding chairman, Chris Underhill, it's one of the things he always used to say was, we'd be asked to garden in all sorts of different locations. And every single time we were asked, I always thought, yes. So it's about being positive and thinking that through small changes. I had a lovely walk around your city yesterday. And actually, there's loads of great tree-lined spaces. I can see planters springing up in places. And you notice people start resonating towards green, don't you? If you actually watch people move, they move towards the greener spaces in order to have a moment of respite. So I think even small spaces are enough, and then it just requires, a little bit of clever horticulture to fit that in. In relation to the second question, how do you become a horticultural therapist? In the UK, we're not a registered profession. Thrive and Trellis in Scotland are working to change that right now. But there's a registration in the US through the American Hort Therapy Association. There are the beginnings of registrations in Germany at the GGUT, my German's even worse than my Latvian, sorry, but Community of Garden Therapists, and similar things happening across Europe, because it's being recognised that that people are ready for it and it's needed, because the medical profession are now listening. 10 years ago, we could have done all of that work, but there's no point in being a registered health professional if no health commissioning is coming your way, or very little of it is. And so, we will get there, but it'll probably take another 5 to 10 years. To become educated in the UK, Thrive provide everything from introductory courses, which are free, which you can do from Latvia, all online if you look at Thrive's website. There are blended short courses, again, available to people all over the country. I've had a classroom where, and I teach this subject. I had a classroom where somebody walked in and said, introduce themselves. You go around the class and say, introduce yourselves. And this person said, hello there, my name's this, I'm from Australia. I've come over for this. No pressure there then, eh? Just a quick 3,000-mile trip just to listen to me. And imposter syndrome feels quite heavy at that point. But, Thrive have been doing this for 40 years. They've always been trying to promote and educate others to do the same. So there are courses, and then we have accredited courses at the equivalent of a second year of a degree course that's accredited with our Open College network that you can access, which is the building blocks of it. The skill set is a real mix. Okay, so the biggest unit on the whole of our diploma is horticulture based, but it's horticulture in relation to SDH. So, for example, I mentioned tomato seedlings in an SDH setting, in a therapeutic horticulture setting. Nobody ever wants to throw away the weak seedling. So it's about recognizing it as a unique style of horticulture, as different as nursery to heritage. It's a completely unique style of horticulture. And for horticulturists, they've got some of the skill set, but they have to learn that. And it can be hard to let go of plants. But if I'm working in a dementia care setting and some elderly lady picks all of the flowers and leaves off of a plant, but does so with a big smile on her face, then that's mission accomplished, because I've improved mood and things like this. So the skill set is, horticulture is important, but it's recognizing, I mentioned it earlier, principles over practice and things like this. But you need some of the skills of a psychotherapist to build relationships and understand the way in which some people have been potentially impacted by disability and ill health, and how that changes the way in which you build relationships with people, and also help them to build relationships with others. And then obviously, you know, some skill set of an occupational therapist is valuable as well, to understand how to do a task and skills analysis or qualities analysis. You can break down an activity and understand it in its minute detail, so you understand the activity as equally well as you understand the person, okay? Because they're the two sides of the choice and decision of which person does what, and how do you adapt or change it to make it achievable, but also meaningful. So how can we grade it like a physiotherapy does in order to make it a rehabilitation activity? And so that's the skill set we try and teach people across our diploma, similar to what they teach in the US. I converse with Rebecca Haller and Andreas Nippau in Germany and other educators, and we support each other to sort of develop these curriculums.